happy spooky season to you all. Okay, so I guess spooky season is kind of over and done with. But you know what?
The world is on fire, we have Nazis again, billionaires are running for president, Someone You Loved by Louis Capaldi is #1 on the Billboard charts.
So fuck it. Spooky season is a year-long affair now. And today, I want to talk about something especially ooky, spooky, kooky. Well, capitalism, but mostly Hereditary.
Mom, what are you doing?
So I don't know if you guys have heard, but according to some eggheads online, we are in the midst of a horror renaissance, a golden age of scary movies. And while grand statements like that should probably be taken with a grain of salt, it's not the biggest reach.
It's true that horror has been having something of a moment with some huge blockbuster hits as well as a string of successful art house indie fare, Hereditary among them, with some more elitist critics even dubbing this wave of films elevated horror.
Which...
But horror, despite the all too common derision and bias against the genre, is and has always been lucrative for Hollywood. Studios have always relied on horror movies as the backbone of the industry.
Yeah, that's right. You can turn your nose up at it all you want, but without the blood, the guts, the gore, you wouldn't be able to finance your elitist Oscar bait about a disabled Hollywood actor trying to save jazz at a concentration camp starring Meryl Streep. The appeal of horror is that it is low risk, high reward. You can produce a horror film on a micro budget and you're pretty much guaranteed to make a profit, or at least to break even.
In the era of streaming platforms churning out content like never before, that's even more true.
So scary movies making money, that's nothing new. What is new is the kind of horror making money. The kind of horror that studios are hedging their bets on. And, perhaps most importantly, the kind of horror that is dominating the discourse.
For much of the aughts and the beginning of the 2010s, the kind of horror getting a wide release was basically either slasher flick reboots,
Man, that bitch got herself a nice little dumper.
Saw movies, or the barrage of derivative found footage movies trying to replicate the success of Paranormal Activity, including its many, many sequels.
And they were all awful.
Sure, you had legitimately great movies like Ty West's The House of the Devil, an extremely genre and extremely slow burn throwback piece.
But that's not what was making money. Until...
If it's in a word or it's in a look, you can't get rid of the Babadook.
While it only made just over $10 million globally, the Babadook got this horror renaissance ball rolling as it became a huge hit when it became available for streaming and achieved memetic levels of success.
And everyone was Baba shook mama, yes, God, the house down boots.
This was followed in quick succession by indie darlings It Follows and The Witch.
Wouldst thou like to live deliciously?
Which were equally acclaimed and even bigger hits commercially. And while Get Out remains the real juggernaut of this new crop of horror films, what I really want to focus on is my favorite film to come out of this renaissance, Hereditary. Not just because it's my favorite, but because I think this film in particular articulates a certain thematic trend that we're seeing in so many recent horror movies.
But first, some history.
Horror as a genre of film is as old as the medium itself, dating as far back as the Universal monster movies of the silent era. And while yes, a lot of it is goofy as hell, horror films, like all art, have always had a role in examining our culture.
But horror as a genre is uniquely well suited to exploring cultural and social anxieties.
According to Adam Lowenstein, it's the horror film that's actually able to engage traumatic history and to confront viewers with it. It's largely because the horror film is already equipped with the tools to shock us, to unsettle us, to disturb us.
Movie monsters are never just monsters. They're always stand-ins for something.
In films like Creature from the Black Lagoon, the titular, well, creature from the Black Lagoon preys upon a beautiful white woman and must be stopped by her handsome white alpha stud. Without getting too into it, let's just say this imagery is, loaded.
More broadly, the horror in horror films, whatever form it may take, never exists solely on a literal or textual level. Much of the horror in horror films is so effective because it taps into cultural anxieties facing audiences in the eras in which the films are produced and seen.
Of course, you also have films offering much more explicit social commentary, be it the Scream series and its meta-analysis of horror and media in general.
Number 1, you can never have sex.
Candyman and its focus on race and gentrification, or They Live with its not terribly subtle criticism of commercialization and Reaganomics.
But usually it's just a touch more subtle.
So at the height of the Cold War, you had several alien invasion films, namely Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is commonly read as a metaphor for America's Red Scare and the fear of a communist invasion, as well as a more generalized xenophobia. Ooh, pinko scum are among us. In the 70s, we saw the rise of the slasher flick as a sort of reaction to the moral panic surrounding teenage sexuality and the violence of the decade. Following 9/11, there was a mini boom of zombie films, including 28 Days Later, a Dawn of the Dead remake, and the Resident Evil series, a trend which now you see it covered in greater detail.
Oh my god. She's so drunk.
It's important to note that these readings aren't necessarily, one-to-one correlations, nor are they always intentional. But if we are to assume that all ways of horror have some sort of underlying theme connecting them all, what is the theme tying the films of this burgeoning indie horror renaissance? Which brings us to...
Hereditary centers on a family caught in the immediate aftermath of the death of a family member, the mother of Toni Collette's character Annie, a relationship that had always been fraught.
And we were pretty much estranged before that, so it really wasn't a huge blow. But I did love her.
The fractures in this family become infinitely worsened when daughter Charlie is, well... And while there are clearly darker forces at play from the beginning of the film, it isn't long after this sequence that what could almost pass as a very, very dark prestige drama, A Portrait of a Family in Grieving, quickly devolves into a nightmare.
Why are you scaring me?
Make it stop! Make it fucking stop! Make it stop!
In her despair and with her relationship with her husband and son in freefall, Annie tries to reach out to Charlie from beyond the grave, and with the help of a character played by Ann Dowd, whom I'm sure is definitely trustworthy and not at all hiding a malevolent agenda. Next thing you know, folks are getting possessed by demons and a big ol' satanic conspiracy is uncovered. By the end of the film, every single member of this family is dead with the sole exception of Peter, who has become a host of Charlie, who was actually the host of a demon this whole time. Hail Payman! One of the words most used when describing Hereditary is upsetting. It's really difficult to overstate just how dark this movie is. And while audience reception was pretty polarized, check out that D+ rating on CinemaScore. It wowed critics and still managed to become A24's biggest commercial success to date, grossing over $79 million globally against a $10 million budget.
But I think the reason that so many people had such visceral reactions to Hereditary wasn't just because it was disturbing or pants-shittingly scary, which it was, but because of its thematic heft and the way that it wrestles with social anxieties like the best horror does.
In his review of the film for The New Yorker, Anthony Lane wrote, "Hereditary has the nerve to suggest that the social unit is, by definition, self-menacing, and that the home is no longer a sanctuary, but a crumbling fortress, under siege from within."
But under siege from what? What meaning can we ascribe to the horror in Hereditary? What cultural anxiety is it grappling with? Well, I'll tell ya.
Fucking baby boomers. The entire catalyst for the plot of Hereditary, the reason for all of the horrors that befall Annie's family, can be attributed to her late mother, Ellen. In her letter to Annie, she writes, "Please don't hate me and try not to despair your losses. You will see in the end that they were worth it. Our sacrifice will pale next to the rewards." The sacrifice, of course, winds up being the lives of Annie and her entire family, minus one Peter/Charlie/demon host. But what are the rewards? In the Invocations book that Annie pulls out of her mom's box of possessions, a photo opposite the image of Payman shows a person sitting atop a mound of treasure with the caption, "Riches to the Conjurer." In addition to that, we also see a photo of cultists showering Ellen with golden coins. In other words,
so we have an older generation ruining the lives of younger generations, all for the sake of monetary gain and success, albeit of the satanic variety. If that sounds like a familiar narrative, that's because it is.
Now, who are the boomers? Well, their parents came home from World War II and they had a lot of sex and they had a lot of kids. Then the kids grew up in a prosperous time where America was the only superpower left.
Baby boomers, the demographic cohort defined as individuals born between as early as 1940 and as late as 1964, have had a huge impact on American politics and the economy since their ascent to political power in the late 60s, when they became old enough to vote, and when they finally began to enter the political stage themselves in the 70s.
The baby boomers. Whiny, narcissistic, self-indulgent people with a simple philosophy. Give me it, it's mine!
In his book, A Generation of Sociopaths, How the Baby Boomers Betrayed America, Bruce Kennan Gibney describes the systemic damage done by the baby boomer generation in very horror terms, going the extra mile and attributing their disastrous impact on the country to a form of sociopathy.
Despite its extremely polemical title, Gibney doesn't go quite so far as to accuse all baby boomers of being literal sociopaths. But he does describe their behaviors, their self-centeredness, their impulsivity, as being sociopathic or antisocial in the clinical sense, and that they display a flagrant disregard for the long-term effects of their actions and instead place far greater importance in short-term gain.
This mindset works dangerously well with capitalism, particularly an unfettered neoliberal strain of capitalism, which is all about amassing as much profit as possible as quickly as possible, consequences be damned. As a result, throughout their tenure, boomers reallocated taxes as it suited their needs to the detriment of all other demographics. According to lawyer, writer, and boomer himself, Stephen Brill, boomers were able to implement risky and immediately profitable instruments for obtaining wealth, but separated those taking the risk from those who would bear the consequences.
To put it in layman's terms, fuck you, got mine.
They all went to college, then they got all the jobs, and they made all the money, and they bought all the houses, and they won't ever die. Boomers!
And young people, crippled with debt and stagnant wages and left in a world that is facing environmental crisis, are the ones dealing with the repercussions.
And they are not happy. The recent widespread use of the phrase "okay boomer" amongst young people is the clearest example of this generational friction.
A stand against older generations' continued irresponsibility and complicity with regards to climate change and economic inequality.
It is also very funny. You know, us millennials and our younger Zoomer brethren are getting real tired of your bullshit, boomers.
Fuck these boomers, fuck these yuppies, and fuck everybody now that I think of it.
So, we have a world on fire that's falling apart due to decades of greed and abuse. Meanwhile, baby boomers accuse millennials of being whiny, entitled, lazy, financially irresponsible, and of killing entire industries because we can't afford frivolous luxury items in the system that they themselves created.
Millennials are killing the napkin industry. Millennials are killing the blood diamond industry. Millennials are killing golf. Millennials are killing Applebee's.
Good. I hate golf. And Applebee's.
But this narrative of elders hurting the lives of their children for their own gain is not limited to just Hereditary.
It only takes a little digging to find this subtext all across this new indie wave of horror.
In The Witch, the father not only makes a decision to uproot his family from England and settle in the Americas, but he gets them banished from the Puritan Plymouth colony and are forced to live in solitude. Next thing you know, babies are going missing, witches are using said babies to make a moisturizing lotion. Maybe she's born with it. Baby fat. Animals are lactating blood, toddlers are speaking to goats, and Miss Thang joins a naked witch coven. Teens, am I right? Once again, we see an older generation behaving recklessly in pursuit of their own interests, but at the cost of their descendants' future. Well, mostly. Our girl Thomason seems like she'll be alright. The 2018 Halloween also has a similar narrative subtext, which shows a time-weathered Laurie Strode who has become a paranoid recluse living in solitude and abandoned her family as a result. Her daughter Karen makes no bones about the trauma her mother's paranoia inflicted upon her as a child. But what I find especially interesting about Halloween is how this intergenerational injustice plays out not only in the character dynamics, but in the very setting of the film. In the original 1978 film, Haddonfield is shown as an archetypal all-American town. Suburban, upper-middle class, cozy, still reaping the benefits secured by previous generations. Comparatively, the Haddonfield of the 2018 film is in rough shape, a crumbling, squandered remnant of the American dream. Even It Follows has echoes of this. The adults in the film are largely absent, but their impact is still felt, an often menacing force looming over the young characters. The film, which was shot in Detroit, also spends a great deal of time showcasing the abandoned, crumbling suburbs of the city, a decay that can largely be attributed to decades of deindustrialization as well as the 2008 recession, in which countless people lost their homes to foreclosure. And while it might be a touch simplistic to place blame for the recession exclusively on boomers, it's not exactly wrong either. But Hereditary is the most explicit and convincing case of this intergenerational tension and how it has pervaded horror in recent years. In his essay, A Political Reading of Hereditary and Awful Parents in Indie Horror's New Wave, Jacob Floyd concludes, Hereditary is a film about how a parent sacrifices the lives and futures of her children and grandchildren for wealth and success, having escaped the consequences herself, to facilitate the ascendancy of an inarticulate, chaos-minded demon king. While Hereditary and the rest of these films succeed even without delving into their political subtext, it's that very subtext that really enriches the horror. When the lengths Ellen has gone to satisfy her own greed at the expense of her family are finally revealed, it's more than just horrifying. It's a betrayal. The sociopathic actions of baby boomers have left us with a rigged economy, a dwindling social safety net, and a planet that is on the brink of environmental disaster. This is the legacy they have left us, and ultimately we will be left to face the consequences of their actions.
And what, pray tell, could be more terrifying than that?